Welcome to the Consumer Code Show, where we believe that humans are incredible and we are living in the first era in history where behavioral data and AI have hit scale so we can go from consumer insight to business activation in no time. In this show, we explore the world of retail through the lens of demography, cartography, ethnography, and the economy. So without further ado, let's get into this episode. Okay, so for the first episode of the Consumer Code Podcast, we are starting out with a banger. I am interviewing Professor Richard Weber, who is the inventor of the psychographic geodemographic segmentation industry. If you've ever experienced Mosaic, if you've ever used Acorn segmentation, the tapestry segmentation, this all came from one guy, Professor Richard Weber. He developed in the 1970s the Acorn segmentation, went on to develop the Mosaic segmentation, which was eventually purchased by Experian. And he's a personal hero of mine. He wrote 2 books that really impacted me. The big one, Geodemographics, GIS, and neighborhood targeting, as well as the predictive postcode. If you are in retail marketing, retail analytics, there's 2 things I want you to pay attention to. The number one thing is his story about meeting Ken Baker, where Ken Baker was a market researcher that would apply surveys to this clustering segmentation. And this is how they would begin to understand people through their behaviors. This is the beginning of this type of thinking in marketing. We still use this today, which is amazing. This is over 50 years later. And this is where it happened. This is the nuts and bolts. The second thing that I love is how Richard Weber pursues his curiosities. And in the wake of him pursuing, huge opportunities tend to follow him. And he's still doing this today with the Origins product that he made, which we'll go through in part 2 of this show. So without further ado, I cannot wait to introduce you to Professor Richard Weber. I am so excited, and it is just an honor to be interviewing you as sort of a figure that I've really looked up to over the years and the inventor of 2 geodemographic segmentation systems, Mosaic and Acorn. Not only that, you've also inspired a lot of research in a lot of other geodemographic segmentation systems, our own being one of those. You've kind of been a father of this industry for the past 50 years, and a lot of the people listening were not even born when you invented your first geodemographic segmentation system. So I was wondering if you could walk our listeners through what a geodemographic segmentation system is. And by the way, in the US, this is called a psychographic segmentation system.
Yes. Well, I'm very honored to have this opportunity to talk to you on film. And it's also rather fun, once again, to be talking about America, because much of the work was done in Britain, and I haven't really had much contact with the US for quite some time. So I'm having to remember the different categories and different places in America and the different ways in which you do things, which is not quite the same as which we do. But I hope what I say is relevant to your listeners, and I'm very much looking forward to talking to you a bit more about it all.
What is a geodemographic segmentation system?
Right. Well, a geodemographic system is really a classification of people based on the type of neighborhood in which they live. So it's what you might call in general terms a taxonomy. And most taxonomies are one-dimensional, like class or age or income or urban-rural. But the purpose of a geodemographic classification is to put all these different dimensions into a single classification system, which is, as it were, multidimensional rather than one-dimensional. And the general experience that we've had is that a classification that incorporates many different dimensions is much more predictive than one that just looks at a single dimension, such as income or age or family type.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I think that kind of leads us into our first question. I'd love if you could take us back to, I believe it is 1973, when you were working with the University of Liverpool, and you were actually doing computer programming back then, which kind of amazes me. That was something that could be done. Like, you were really early on in this, and they were asking you to develop a system to help understand deprivation in that area, so to create programs for that. So can you walk us through that project and how that eventually morphed into Acorn?
When I went to the university, that was for my master's degree, I had no idea that I would have to learn computer programming. And within the first week, they told us that was part of the course. I almost left the course because that wasn't really what I wanted to do. However, during the course, I did learn Fortran, And I thought it would be rather fun to build a application which is of a sort called cluster analysis, whereby you have a whole lot of records and you want to put them into sensible groups such that each category is as similar as possible across a large number of different attributes. Now, I had fun writing this really for my own pleasure. And then subsequently, when I got my first proper job, we had a request from the city of Liverpool, quite accidentally, since they had been in receipt of a very large grant from central government to address problems of deprivation in the city, of which there was a large amount. It was probably Britain's poorest city. The city planners who engaged me to do this work, up to that point, they had various indicators of deprivation. And what they did was to rank all the neighbourhoods in Liverpool from most deprived to least deprived. And all the money from the government went to the relatively few neighbourhoods that were the most deprived. And that really wasn't really very efficient, because there were many different reasons for people being deprived, and people were deprived in different ways in different types of neighbourhood. So it may seem a bit strange that a system that ultimately became used to classify relatively well-off people in different sorts of neighbourhoods actually started by classifying people in different sorts of disadvantaged areas. But the computer system and the application works equally well whether you're looking at the top end of the scale or the bottom end. Just to explain a little bit more, perhaps, I think you may be able to imagine in Liverpool there was a lot of very old, what we call terraced housing, but I think you called it row housing, dating from the 18th century, and much of it was in very poor repair. Had very close networks of kinship and friendship, so people knew each other, but they were living in housing that really needed to be modernized, and parks needed to be built and streets cleaned up. And generally, it was a tatty type of area where more investment was needed in physical infrastructure. On the other hand, if you went behind the docks in Liverpool, there were large numbers of people who were unskilled or unemployed because of containerization. And their problem was much more to do with education. And then another sort of area contained what I call rooming houses. I don't know if that's a familiar term in America, but I think that
It's
came
not.
from... No. Well, these would
Yeah.
be big old houses which were built for people who had well enough off to employ servants, and they became far too large for a family in the modern age. And they got split up into little bedsits, and all kinds of different people who are floating people, homeless people, immigrants, people come out of prison, people who are divorced, all sorts of people who had some kind of problem in their life. That would be the easiest place for them to settle. So I think you can imagine in that third group of areas, what was really needed was daycare, nurseries, community centres. And the whole idea of the project really was to feed different sorts of investments into these different sorts of areas.
One question I have for you on that is, it feels like there's something so special that happens between the human and the computer, where the computer has defined these areas in very quantifiable and measurable ways. But it took you as a human to make sense of that, right? There's this kind of like these two circles of like the human understanding and the computer measurement. How did you go about when you first created this cluster system of deprivation? How did you go about exploring and figuring out the why behind why the computer had
Yeah.
done that?
Well, you see, I think this is very interesting. That the reason I'm really looking forward to working with you is you have got access to so much behavioral data that you can link to typologies. But if you think back to the 70s, if there were behavioral data, it wasn't very easy to link it to any kind of classification system. What the planners in Liverpool had done, which I thought was very forward thinking, they collected a lot of their service data by geographical coordinates. So once we'd finished the classification system, they could add up all their data, and instead of saying these were the general areas of the city where there were a lot of house fires, they could say these are the specific types of neighbourhood where there were house fires, or where children suffered from infectious diseases. So for the first time, we could relate service data to the typology. which,
Mm.
although the service data may not be very interesting to people listening to this podcast today, I think the practice is very similar. Build a typology based on demographic data and then link that to behavioral data subsequently. And that's what we did in Liverpool, and it worked extremely well. And to answer your question, it was because we had all that service data for the different types of neighborhood that we could understand the kind of social issues and the reasons why they had developed as they had, and what sorts of provision would be relevant to their inhabitants.
Man, this is such a thread that, like, you experienced this in the 1970s. This is still true today. Like, we still see these things where if you just look primarily at the demographics of someone, you may have some expectations of them, but based on their actual behaviors, things are quite different. Just like you were saying, there's different types of needs in the three different examples that you gave. And we see kind of a similar thing with this. Like, I'll give you an example. Hispanic households that are very low income are primarily not considered a very profitable thing in the United States. However, what we see is those people are extremely interested in two things from the consumer standpoint. One is the education of their children, depending on their income level. If they're like medium income, then their education of their children, they will spend everything on that. The second thing is actually cosmetics. So they
Yes.
might not be a profitable thing for insurance or whatever, but cosmetics, they will spend a lot of money on it. And it's just not, it is unexpected, but there's these different behavioral needs that people have that are not purely attached to their demographics. I think that's beautiful. So how did you go from that study of deprivation to make the jump into this commercial world with Acorn?
Well, once the Liverpool project had been completed, I found myself being asked by a number of other cities in England to build similar classifications for them as well, which was very enjoyable to begin with, but it became a bit tedious. Fortunately, we had some quite good connections with the Census Office, and they thought it would be a good idea to provide us with the same statistics that we'd got for Liverpool or Cumbria or Rochdale or wherever, for everywhere, all in one big go. This meant that we could classify small neighbourhoods throughout the entire country, and if Hartlepool wanted a classification, we would just ship them the classification, the national classification, but for Hartlepool area. And the real benefits of having a national classification was not only it saved a lot of time, but also the local authority, the city council, could compare types of neighbourhood that were more common in it than in other ones. So there's quite a good example of a city council called Wirral, which was across the Mersey from Liverpool. And they were bidding for central government money. But if they looked at aggregate data from Wirral, it didn't look a particularly disadvantaged area. But when they looked at the national classification, they had a particularly high proportion of people in very disadvantaged areas, but then quite a high proportion in areas that weren't disadvantaged at all. So if you looked at aggregate data for Wirral, it looked not an area that should receive government money, but when you can break down the neighbourhoods by category, you could see there were a lot of areas that really did need a lot of attention. And they were successful in getting funding specifically because of the use of this national classification.
So at that point, you had done this national classification because
Yes.
the census in the UK, they were, which was not widely available at the time, gave you all this data to be able to create that more generalized classification for the UK. How did it eventually become Acorn? When
Yes.
was the moment? How did that transform?
You can imagine, I was at that time working in a national sort of social research institute, and we would have little seminars from time to time, and we had a little seminar on our classification. And a gentleman turned up who I didn't quite know who he was, and he said he was a market research company. And I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, I'm having trouble with my clients. We've changed our sampling frame, and the results of my surveys are giving some degree of concern to some of the clients. And they're beginning to ask whether we're actually interviewing enough people in high-rise flats or we're avoiding other sorts of areas." So he thought the best way of investigating this was actually to stick the classification codes onto his survey and actually see whether his sample frame was a good representation of the country as a whole. And he was called Ken Baker, and credit to him for coming along. I mean, it's quite a brave thing for a market research person to come and meet a whole lot of local authority and academic people. But he said, what would the cost of getting this data be? And I said it was £167. So he took it away, and it's probably the best £167 he's ever spent. And for me, it was a good thing that I didn't charge him a lot of money, and he decided it was too much. So he took away the stuff on the spot, and he had a look at his sample. Now, once he'd done that, he thought it would be rather fun to actually do some cross-tabulations between the categories on some of the hundreds of brands and products on his survey. Now, that wasn't really what he was intending to do, but he thought he'd just have a bit of fun. And as he went through all kinds of different product fields that were interest to the clients and that were on his survey, he kept on finding he was getting more discrimination than he used to get if he just looked at one-dimensional classifications like income or age. So it then occurred to him, rather than just use this for sample frames, it was a very nice add-on to the services he was supplying, or his company was supplying to the clients, because then they could also get tabulations by what then became Acorn. Now, originally it was called CRN, the Classification of Residential Neighborhoods, but as always, a person from an advertising agency thought they could do a bit better, and they put an A at the beginning and an O in the middle. So that's how it became called Acorn. So really, with the support of the market research company Baker worked for, the concept really extended into the world of market research and marketing. And were it not for that visit, probably I wouldn't be talking to you now, would I?
Man, it really could be. I just want to kind of pause here and mention for our listeners how critical of a moment this was when Ken Baker looked at this and recognized that he could apply his survey data to these geodemographic segmentation systems, or the first one essentially that had been built, at least in the UK. This was the first time that we had attached behavior in a commercial sense to a clustering system. And this is still used today. We're here 50 years later, and this same type of thinking is still used throughout marketing. So all the marketers listening to this, all the market researchers listening to this is when it first happened. Like, we were looking down at the nuts and bolts of the history of how this happened. And one of the things that you said, Richard, early on is almost by accident, the city of Liverpool had this, huge grant. And this created an opportunity for you. Almost by accident, Ken Baker shows up at this group of academics and sees your presentation. And to me, it feels like there's something that's almost not by accident in your life, where you are pursuing these things that are interesting to you. But as you do that, these other things come along, and to me, it almost feels very intentional that these things happen, and then we have these segmentation systems that understand people today.
Well, we're going to have another little accident a bit later in this discussion, I think, but I better not tell you what it is just now.
Oh, so this will be, great. This will be new to me. That is awesome.
Well, it may be news or it may not be. I think it will be news.
Great. Oh, cool.
If I may, can I just develop a little bit on what happened next? Because I think you can imagine that if you present the rather clever nicknames that were originally given to the prism categories, and I think there's a man called Mr. Weiss.
Barry Weiss, yeah.
Yeah, so he worked in an advertising agency, and he, I'm told, helped, was it Jonathan Robin?
Yep, with Prism in the...
Yes. So he helped commercialize Prism because he came up with memorable 20-character titles for the clusters. So I can still remember shotguns and pickups, or was it pickups and shotguns? Another one.
Such a beautiful name that will no longer fly today.
Lower Bohemia, I thought was one. So I think you can imagine that when we sold what was becoming Acorn to local authorities, they didn't like anything like that at all. But on the other hand, the world of marketing and advertising wanted memorable labels that meant something to them. And the other thing they wanted was photographs. So they wanted to see examples of the housing. And if you could show that a certain category, like Coronation Street, which is what we called it, very large number of houses in Coronation Street all looked exactly the same, whichever town they were in. This helped people to visualize and memorize what the categories were. This was something that was totally foreign to the public sector, civil servant, town planners. They really didn't like this way of looking at neighborhoods. And there's always been this tension ever since. In fact, Experian had the same version of Mosaic with two totally different label sets, one for the public sector and one for the private sector. The categories were the same, it's just that they couldn't agree on the same terminology. So it is very important what Vice did, and Jonathan Robin and Prism, I think, and they convinced us that you had to jazz up the classification and make it accessible to marketing people.
So at this point, you had created this classification. You'd kind of agreed that they needed these little thumbnail names, and that kind of helped at least the commercial sector understand, all right, okay, I have a good sense of who these people are just based on the thumbnail names. And then you mentioned the photos. I'd love to dig into that. Is it true? I actually don't know if this is the case or not, but I have heard rumor. Were you the person that originally took a lot of the photos for the Acorn and the Mosaic segmentation? Did you actually go there and check out these places?
Well, to begin with, I went on sort of rather random visits to various parts of the country where I knew there was a lot of a certain type. But when I stopped working for Experian and became self-employed, I suggested to them, and they agreed, that I would spend a fortnight traveling around the country to everywhere, taking lots and lots of photographs before they actually built the new Mosaic. So what we used to do is we built the classification and then we took the photographs. But actually, there's a lot of merit in having taken the photographs without having built the classification yet, because you're recording the postcodes or the zip codes or the locations. And then when you've built the classification, you can actually verify whether it looks sensible by whether a particular category has photographs that all look relatively similar sorts of neighborhood. And during that process, we did revise the actual classification marginally, so we can rerun the cluster program with more weights to some variables and split up some categories. And we actually improved the classification by having got pictures before we started.
Boy, I would have never expected that.
Yes. And it was very helpful. And also, it speeds up the interpretation, because instead of just looking at the statistics for each category, you've got pictures as well. And it was a really much better way of doing it than how we used to do it. But the most interesting for me part of this journey was it included Northern Ireland. And there were certain parts of Northern Ireland where you weren't really supposed to visit. And in the Catholic areas, they had deliberately removed the signposts that told you what street you were in. And it was very difficult to record the postcodes of the places where you'd taken pictures. And if you go around Catholic areas taking pictures and you look like an Englishman, you don't necessarily get a very good reception. So I think I was rather lucky to survive that assignment.
So you're talking about something that's a little culturally different in the UK than the United States. What is it like? How could they have pictured you? How would they have looked at you and in a Catholic area and know that you were an Englishman? Like, what do you look like that they don't look like?
I've no idea, but it's something they're very good at. I mean, they've got decades of being able to tell which person's a Protestant and which is a Catholic, and they certainly know from your name what you are.
Yes, for sure. Oh boy, we're about to get into the names things as well.
Yes.
Boy, that's cool. I mean, so the rumor's true. You did take a lot of these pictures. The twist in the story is that you took the pictures before the classifications were created.
Exactly. Yes.
And that is what helps inform the classifications. And that's always kind of been a tricky problem, which is the verification. How do we know these classifications are true? You know, so there's a few ways of doing it. You can look at its discrimination capability and detecting trade areas and how well a retailer's doing at trade areas. Does it describe that? You can look at it on a map and get a general qualitative feel. And then this last piece, which is interesting to me, you actually physically visited those areas and you can verify if the machine is clustering something that is mathematically true or humanly true, right? And so you were able to capture some of that. That's really cool.
Now, if I may, I'd like to go back to one of the points you made just now, because in the old days, we built the classifications, then we matched them to the behavioral data, and then we interpreted the clusters. But what we realized we could do is if we had a system for tagging the behavioral data to the census data before we did the clustering, as soon as we'd done the clustering, we could make a statistical measure of how well it discriminated on various non-census variables, consumer products. So we could actually create a statistical measure saying that this cluster system, not a system, but this run of the cluster analysis worked better than that one. And whenever you're running these things, you can always change the number of categories or the starting points or the weights to different variables. So that was actually a very good way of validating whether the classification you had built was better than other trial runs that you'd been running.
Yep. Yeah, and there's a balance there too, right? Because I think what we discovered when creating the personalized segmentation, we used a similar thing where we're looking at retail sales. We had a lot of retail sales data, and then we introduced variables in a stepwise way to see which variables were the most predictive.
Yes.
But then so that is useful, and I think that is a really good first approach at it. But there's also this qualitative piece that not only do they need to be predictive, they also need to create some sort of qualitative sense of these people that are actionable, because we can use this to predict trade areas. We can also use this to inform our marketing, which you of course did a lot, especially early in the direct mail. Boy, that was a huge invention in direct mail, so that these people can create things that resonate with the people that are receiving the copy and the imagery of the advertisement.
Yes, well, that is a very important and interesting issue, the extent to which in the culture of these classifications, the qualities of the categories are conveyed to the copywriters and the people who are selecting imagery for adverts. It probably happens in Britain to some extent, but not nearly as to great an extent as I think it could.
Are you talking about just the descriptions of the segmentation?
Yes. And also all the imagery that comes with it.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
For example, I mean, one of the things that Experian at least pioneered in Britain was for each geodemographic segment, there was a sheet with the brand names which were strongest in that segment compared with other segments. So an advertising person could look at this array of brands, logos almost, and many of the logos or the adverts they were in were actually pictures of people doing things. So they had a nice portfolio of images and brands that helped them to determine the right tone of voice.
Yeah, it's a really good anchor, especially brands can be good anchors for understanding people. Like in the United States, Patagonia is a brand that's really well known for outdoors. And if you have a people that over-index on following Patagonia, you know there's some sort of affinity there. I'd like to hear from you because I want to transition to origins, which I'm super excited about hearing, because a lot of the history of origins is not quite captured. This will be really the first time. But I'd love to kind of end this piece on the geodemographics on over the past 50 years of being what I consider the father of this industry and watching geodemographics continue to grow, expand across different borders. What do you look back the most fondly on with the uses of geodemographics? Is there any projects or any unexpected use that that still excites you?
I think the application that I feel has probably been most important for our country has been the use of geodemographic systems by the political parties. So right from a very early stage, they all saw the benefit of targeting mail shots and door drops, or even evaluating voting areas by Mosaic and Acorn. And I think that is very satisfying to realize that when the election comes, that the data you've been involved with is sitting at the heart of the targeting strategy.
Yeah, and even like with the Ken Baker part of your story, one of the things that was cool that the geodemographics was able to do is to detect if people were more likely to read the Guardian or the Telegraph.
Yes, well, actually, I think that example is worth developing a little bit, because what Ken discovered, I think, was that within the upper middle classes or middle classes in this country, there was a big divide between the more liberal ones and the more conservative ones. So that's a division between the Guardian and the Telegraph. And it's even a division between people who play tennis and people who play golf, for example, or people who go on holiday to France in the countryside, or people who go on cruises. So there are huge behavioural differences between the more liberal and the more conservative members of the middle class. And what I think we're beginning to realise is that these are associated very much with what courses people have done when they went to university. More place that employs a lot of people who have done arts degrees is more likely to end up in the liberal categories of Mosaic than ones where they've studied technology. And if you look at where arts degrees people work, they work in law, in advertising, in publishing, in the media, influencing professions. And these are very much in big cities, whereas the technologists are more likely to work on the outskirts or in smaller towns or places where there's more space to manufacture things. And as time has gone on in Britain, and I'm sure this is true likewise in America, you get this increasing cleavage between the sort of arts-oriented urban areas and the technology ones. And that is reflected in voting habits too.
I am really curious. You mentioned there's a difference between people that play tennis and people that play golf.
Yes.
What's the story there?
Well, I mean, I don't know what this is, but I think if you're playing tennis, you have to make an instinctive reaction to a shot. Whereas in golf, you've got plenty of time to get it just right. Now, if I was manufacturing an airline, I would want to have somebody who played golf, who could go through things in detail and get it right before they assembled the airplane. If, on the other hand, I was looking to recruit a newsreader, I think I would be more interested in somebody who could react rapidly to a situation.
You know, as we're talking about this, one of the things in looking at geodemographic segmentations that's really stuck with me is the amount of influence that the people around you have. Physically living near someone statistically changes who you are. And I mean, that's really important as probably a young person that might be listening to this. Whoever you live near really matters a lot. Could you kind of expound on this phenomena? Why are people so impacted by those that live near them?
I think what I've been mentioning before is one of the factors. So if you go to live in, there's a few places in America I've lived in is Eugene, Oregon, you might be influenced by the fact there are a lot of people who are connected with the university and research. Now, the second thing is that you might actually live there because you chose to live there. So to some extent, neighborhoods become increasingly polarized because they select people who think they will fit into them. And you, because you've got 3 children, may also say, I'm not really too bothered as to whether I fit into the neighborhood, but you would like a place where you think your children would fit in with the other children in the neighborhood. So I think families with children are particularly fussy about going to live in a place where their children will get on, and obviously schools are an important consideration. I think half of the difference between neighborhoods is due to people making the choice as to where they're going to live, and the other half is being affected once they've got there to fit in with the norms of their neighborhoods and the people at church or school gates or whatever. It's a bit of each, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. You're self-selecting into this, and then the fact that you did self-select into it makes you significantly more open to all the influences that are around you.
We read in the papers that in the US, your congressional districts are becoming more polarized. And we're told that the theory is that people in the States are more particular where they go to live because of the values and politics of the neighborhood. Well, not just the neighborhood, the bigger neighborhood, not just the immediate one.
Yeah. And there could be this argument that says, all right, well, we have a more digital world, and so we're going to be more influenced digitally than we ever before were. Maybe, but what I have actually seen, Richard, is that because of what you were saying, there's these polarizing type ideologies that are they're amplified through the media, which drives people even more in a lot of places. This isn't true everywhere, but to live near people that have similar belief systems to them. And this, again, increases the capability of geodemographics to discriminate and describe clusters of people, which you would have thought it would have happened in the reverse, but it didn't.
Yes. But I think today people have more discretion over where they live than where they used to.
Yep. Which, again, so you have these behavioral reasons why you're opting into a physical location.
Yes.